guys, welcome back. So I got a little inspired by a movie that I had watched for the first time recently. Just did a review on it in The Ice Cream Man, and I kind of started to think. I know I've kind of brought this up in the past. I think it's been a few years since I kind of brought this up. But as many of you know, or maybe you may not know, depending on like how old you are, but a lot of us kind of remember in the 90s horror really not being a good thing. It was very much a dirty word. It very much was. I grew up in the 90s, very much a 90s kid. I was an 80s baby. I was a 90s kid. And, 90s were really, obviously as I was growing up, that was really kind of when I started taking a liking to horror movies, checking out different movies, we're talking about movies like Friday the 13th, Halloween, The Gate, some Vincent Price movies, a lot of Stephen King things, like always kind of coming in at me and everything. So like a lot of you guys, there's a lot of it that I kind of was introduced to, and therefore I kind of started looking at like video shelves and everything, going to my mom and pop video store and everything, and kind of looking for different things. A lot of times, like I said, I would kind of watch some of the, like the 70s and the 80s horror, some like Vincent Price stuff. But the 90s though, like we give so much praise to the 80s, so much praise to the 70s and whatnot, even like the 2000s and everything, even post-Scream mid-90s, we give more praise to. Which, that's another thing, hopefully I will remember to kind of bring up in a few minutes. But the 90s in general, especially the first half, like I said, horror was such a dirty word back then. It's still kind of a little bit dirty word if people are a little, like, unaware about horror movies and, like, just aren't their thing or anything. But the 90s, like, even I feel like some horror fans sometimes are kind of like, ooh, dude, like, actually most of us horror fans are like, oh yeah, we like that stuff. Like, oh, no, it's okay. I just watched Jaws or something, like things like that. But looking back at some of that stuff, I mean, we had a lot of misses, like we do with any decade of horror. Like, there's always going to be those bad movies, but there's also going to be a lot of those movies where you kind of look back and you think, oh my god, that was so good, and that came out in the 90s. I mean, some of the movies that you might kind of think of like from the 90s, it depends, but when you think of like good horror movies, like Candyman is one of the first ones that kind of come to mind. Like, that was such a brilliant movie, even still to this day. That is definitely one of those movies that I've often kind of said, like, yeah, I watched it later in life. It's not when I watched it as a kid, but as an adult has quickly become one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Because it's written great, it's got great actors, great story and everything. We have other things. I mean, I'll even say, I know it's a little bit, I feel like at the time was really kind of bashed and kind of like discredited was Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs. I remember seeing that. It must have been on Monster Vision with Joe Bob Briggs. It had to be, I want to say, and I remember seeing that, coming across it, and I was like, I really kind of like this. I really do, like pre My So-Called Life, AJ Langer from My So-Called Life, she played Rayanne, I should say. So kind of see her, fun fact with that, she was 18 when she was in that movie, playing like a 13-year-old. So there's certain things like that. I mean, and even like I said, I brought up Scream and everything. You have those movies and everything, but then you have other movies, like such as like, Ice Cream Man. I'll give Ice Cream Man its credit where it's due. It's in my review. I was kind of like, yeah, it's really not the greatest, but there is something about it that is kind of fun. And that's what horror movies are. It's like, they should be fun. So you had a lot of those movies where I think a lot of people who might not be like a lot of us, where we watch a lot of different horror-related things, read different horror-related things, where they might watch as a casual viewer of horror might look at this and be like, that is the dumbest piece of shit ever. Like, no wonder, oh yeah, I came from 95. Oh yeah, like, 90s don't always suck. There are a lot of gems in there. And like I said, I think a lot of us are kind of now really looking back at the 90s, seeing some of the stuff that came out at that time, and realizing there was, even before Scream and that kind of like, ooh, it's saved horror. It's like, there was a lot of things that were coming out. And the other thing, too, that I don't think the 90s gets a lot of credit for, like the 80s, I know gets a lot of credit for doing this, but not so much the 90s. And that is that I feel like there was another surge of sort of experimenting with horror. Because at this point, horror was pretty much dead. We were all very fatigued by the whole slasher movement. And that's the thing. In the 80s, it wasn't all like slasher movies. A lot of them were slashers, but you also had things such as Jacob's Ladder and Pet Sematary, where it wasn't a guy with a knife, basically. And that's not always a bad thing. I mean, it's not bad to love slashers. I admit, I love my slashers. I love my 80s slashers. I will be the first to admit that. But, the 80s really were, you saw, a lot of that experimentation and everything, or even with, like, Hellraiser and stuff. Even that, it's not a slasher, dude. Just saying. But then with, like, the 90s, with horror really being on a lull and everything, not really bringing the money, and people were kind of trying to find, like, the next big thing for several years now. For the first over half a decade, up until Scream, you saw a lot of those experimentations and everything. Like I said, I brought up People Under the Stairs. That's another prime example in my opinion, that is one where, okay, yeah, it's from the 90s, might kind of have a little bit of that tarnish because it was from the early 90s, but we actually do sit down and watch it. It's pretty smart. It is pretty smart. I like it and everything. When you think about it, like, ooh, that could happen. Like, you never know. Like, I feel like we have heard of similar stories such as these sort of like horror houses and everything that look normal on the outside and really aren't. So there's things like that. God, so many. Couple of remakes. I know there's several remakes during the 90s. One that always stood out for me that I've always kind of really enjoyed, because you guys know I'm very picky about reboots, remakes, and stuff. We had Night of the Living Dead, the remake by Tom Savini and everything. A lot of us know kind of the story behind that. But yeah, to see that, another really good one. That came out in 1990, so I feel like that kind of sort of set the tone of like, hey, look, do what you have to do some reimagining if you need to. Like, don't be afraid to kind of borrow from generations past, put a little, like, twist on some things. Like, it's okay, it's okay. So, and I know that they did do that remake with a lot of the original cast and everything to kind of get a proper copyright and get some of these people who were involved in the original to, actually kind of get properly paid for the movie and everything that they participated in, like, 22 years before. So, yeah. But, yeah, we also had, a lot of things. We had other remakes such as House on Haunted Hill or whatever it was. We had 13 Ghosts and everything. So we really did kind of start getting the whole, like, remake craze. I feel like it really kind of started in the 90s more. We've always had remakes, I know, but I feel like we kind of started seeing some more of that. I know a lot of times we criticize the early 2000s for kind of doing that, but the 90s kind of did that, and I feel like the 90s was a little more selective. Like, we're, like, doing some of those, like, older movies, those kind of like sci-fi B-type movies and stuff. And as a matter of fact, in 93, we had our second remake of, give me a minute, guys, of, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is one that I kind of like, too. That definitely is not as good as the 78 version of the remake, but it's still noteworthy to kind of watch, because I like some of the stuff that they did with that. I think it was like somewhere on like a military base or something. Very kind of 90s sort of twist to it and everything. But even something like that, like, I don't really hear that many people talk about that remake. I feel like it's always the 78 version, which, I mean, rightfully so, because that is such a great retelling of that original story and everything. But yeah, like I said, that came out like 93, 94, the 90s remake, and it's still like it's been a while since I've watched it, but it's still like a decent retelling of that movie. Like I personally I do favor the 78 remake more, but there's something about that one that I feel like doesn't get enough credit. And then, like I said, I keep bringing up Scream. So yeah, we had Scream that came out in 96, the end of 96. A lot of people, praise that as, it really kind of saved horror. And I mean, I do agree. I do agree because I feel like that came out, Wes Craven came out with that. You know, all these stars and everything, and kind of up and coming rising stars that nailed it. Nailed it. And then we got the sequel the following year, I believe, 97. And like, yeah, we started getting a lot more horror movies after that. But in my opinion, like, they were still kind of not that great. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I really don't. But, I feel like with the whole, like, kind of Scream and everything and saving that, we still had to kind of wait a few more years till we started getting some more original ideas. It wasn't just necessarily like, okay, slasher again, and I'm glad that we were able to kind of veer off with that a little bit of like, hey, you know what, people do love slashers, but let's put a little twist on it. So then you started seeing some stuff like after Urban Legends, and I know it came out in 2001, but like stuff like Valentine, once we kind of were able to move past that of like, okay, like we kind of got them hooked back in with some of these sort of slasher-esque sort of homages from the 80s, let's start doing other stuff. So that's when you started seeing stuff like The Wrong Turns, Hostel, the Saw movies, Final Destination 2, actually, because that was what, 90, or no, I believe about 2000 right there, so it's kind of not quite a 90s movie, but it was right there. And I feel like that sometimes, that first Final Destination, because I mean, everyone kind of talks about Final Destination, oh, the kills and everything, and so the sequels are all like the kill based. How are these people going to die? But like that first one, I definitely would put it kind of in that sort of 90s type of movie. Like I said, I know it was actually like released in 2000 or so, but it's, that was one too that helps kind of bridge the two decades and be like, hey, you know what, like there are other ways that we can, maybe even if it's like a similar story, but there's a way to make it separate from like a slasher movie. Like, ooh, death is coming. Like, what would you do if death was coming? Can you stop it? Can you do this? So it started some of these ideas, some of these experiments and everything that people were trying in the 90s. I think we're now finally starting to take place of like, hey, you know what? I kind of like this idea, but let's try this. So you started seeing more of that, and then, like I said, into the 2000s is when we really seemed to start getting back on track with horror movies. I feel like we did kind of fall off there for a little bit, but not so much where we were returned to the 90s and it's like, oh, horror movies. No, we still have that badge of honor. We got some misses, we got some hits and stuff, but yeah, the 90s, there's so many great 90s movies that we need to talk more about. We need to, people love the 90s, appreciate the 90s. I'm just saying. Like I said, I feel like the 90s have started to kind of, people have started looking back, not at just some of the key moments like Scream or Candyman or whatnot, but looking at all these other movies, like I said, like Ticks or The Ice Cream Man, some of these like lesser known ones, or like The Lawnmower Man, Brain Scan. Brain Scan came out in the early 90s, 93, 94, and like talk about that kind of stuff where we had some of these sort of like virtual reality type of movies where that's kind of like the central focus or it has something to do with it. Because virtual reality, I've said this before, at the time, we all thought that was going to be the next big thing. We still had to wait like almost 20 years. Even that, I don't even know if it's like kind of run its course with virtual reality. But things like that, it was kind of taking advantage of that and kind of going after and seeing like, what can we do with stuff like this? So, yeah. So what are some of your favorites, like 90s moments, whether it's in TV, movies, like anything horror related? What are some of your favorite 90s things, that things that came from the 90s? Like, what's some thoughts, man. I want to hear from you. But on that note, you guys, until next time, as always, stay creepy, classy, and a little bit sassy.